Today's content framing question is, what does a deeper exploration of grandfather's character reveal in grandfather's journey? Alright, so before we get started with the meat of our lesson today, what I want us to do is I want us to first warm up with drawing a sketch of the most important event in grandfather's journey to you. Alright, so what I want you to do is I want you to draw a picture on a piece of paper, and you can take a picture and upload it onto our assignment, or you can also click the plus create icon and you can use the drawing feature on Google Classroom, and you can draw a sketch on your tablet if you're using a tablet. Alright, so today's content framing question again was, what does a deeper exploration of grandfather's character reveal in grandfather's journey? So when we think about the word character, we should be thinking about what we already know and what we've already learned about character. So you should be thinking of two different concepts, character traits and character feelings. Character feelings are emotional responses to actions around the characters, and character traits tell us who a character is. Examples of character feelings could be annoyed, hopeful, disappointed, while traits are determined, nosy, leader, and brave. However, now we need to talk about how characters drive the story. So how do characters drive a story? How do they affect what's happening in the story? First, their feelings help us get into the story. Then, they also take us to different places. That can be the different settings. They are always changing to help the story move along. They also cause a problem and then fix them. They also react to the problems or a goal. And they also interact with other characters. What I'm going to do is I'm going to model for you how you should be filling out these evidence organizers. The example that I'm going to show you is for the third question, which is, how do grandfather's feelings about home and moving affect the events of the story? So that's one of the three questions we need to constantly ask ourselves. Then here in this first column, you'll see ATF. ATF stands for the actions, thoughts, and feelings. Because we're specifically looking and exploring grandfather's character, we're specifically looking at his actions, his thoughts, and his feelings. So here you need to identify if it's an action or thought or a feeling based off the text evidence that you pulled from the book. Here you are going to write your text evidence that is the exact sentence or the exact phrase that comes from grandfather's journey, and you're going to type that here. Then here you're going to write kind of your explanation or elaboration of how that piece of evidence answers this question. Then finally, in this bottom row, you are going to write the answer to this question. So please make sure that you use your sentence starters that you've been learning in class in order to answer questions correctly. For example, how do grandfather's feelings about home and moving affect the events? You can say grandfather's feeling, or the feeling that we are going to discuss in just a second, affect the events by, okay. All right, and I already picked two pages, pages 4 and 5, to find my text evidence to help me understand how to answer that question. Okay, so first we need to reread pages 4 and 5. Page 4 says, my grandfather was a young man when he left his home in Japan and went to see the world. Page 5 says, he wore European clothes for the first time and began his journey on a steamship. The Pacific Ocean astonished him. So now, thinking about evidence that tells us how his feelings about home and moving affect the events, we need to take a look carefully at grandfather, our main character of this story. We saw on page 4, grandfather went to see the world, and we know that that is an action. So here I'm going to write A for action, or you can write out action, doesn't matter. And here in text evidence, I'm going to write grandfather went to see the world. I'm going to note that it's from page 4. And how does that sentence tell us how his feelings affect the events? I'm going to write here, this tells me that grandfather wants to leave home and travel. The fact that grandfather went to go see the world means that he wants to leave home and travel. He wants to see what the world looks like. Our second piece of evidence that we can find from pages 4 through 5 can be on page 5, where the text says, the ocean astonished grandfather. So the word astonished means surprised. So we know that if the ocean astonished grandfather, we know that he's excited about what he sees as he begins his journey from Japan, right? So he's surprised by what he sees around him, which tells us that he's excited to explore. So here we see a feeling. Grandfather is feeling surprised. He's feeling astonished by the ocean. So we're going to put an F here. Then we need to make sure that we write down our elaboration or our explanation of why this text evidence supports our answer to how grandfather's feelings affect the events. So that can be, grandfather is excited about what he sees as he begins his journey from Japan. So one answer that you can include here of how do his feelings about home and moving affect the events in the story is that grandfather is, I'm going to have us try to guess it before, about the world, so he decides to travel. So we talked a lot about this particular word when we discussed certain explorers, especially Jacques Cousteau and Galileo Galilei. We know that they wanted to discover and explore the sea and space more because they were blank about the world. They were feeling blank about the world. They wanted to know more. So that word is, I hope you guessed it, it is curious. Yes. So grandfather is curious about the world, so he decides to travel. So this is basically how you fill out one of these evidence organizers. Here in the first column, you're writing down whether this is an action, a thought, or a feeling. Here you're writing evidence from the text. I also would like you, if you can, to write down the page number. If not, just write exactly what Alan Say wrote in his book, and I'll know that the sentence comes from the book. Then here we need to explain further of how this evidence answers our question. And finally, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you answer the question, how do grandfather's feelings about home and moving affect the events of the story? Grandfather is curious, that is the feeling. He's curious about the world, so he decides to travel, which allows the rest of the book to play out with him traveling all the way to California. So we know here he went to see the world. That's the character's action. So today will be the third day of us reading through Grandfather's Journey by Alan Say, with our focus being really studying and understanding and exploring grandfather's character. Okay? And so, like we said before, we are going to be looking specifically at his actions, his thoughts, and his feelings. And we're going to find evidence in our text to help us answer these 3 questions that we have in our classwork today in our evidence organizers. Again, those 3 questions are the following. What makes it hard for grandfather to get what he wants? How does grandfather succeed or not succeed in getting what he wants? And how do grandfather's feelings about home and moving affect the events of the story? So, as per request for some students, We're going to read through the book again, but I'm going to take it a little bit slower so that I can show you the words on the page, and so that you can still pause the video if you'd like to stay on the page, but so you can also see the text more closely. All right? So please make sure you are paying attention, as you will need to find evidence from this book today to fill out your text evidence organizers. All right. Grandfather's Journey by Alan Say. Again, we're thinking carefully about grandfather's character. My grandfather was a young man when he left his home in Japan and went to see the world. He wore European clothes for the first time and began his journey on a steamship. The Pacific Ocean astonished him. For 3 weeks, he did not see land. When land finally appeared, it was the New World. He explored North America by train and riverboat and often walked for days on end. Deserts with rocks like enormous sculptures amazed him. The endless farm fields reminded him of the ocean he had crossed. Huge cities of factories and tall buildings bewildered and yet excited him. He marveled at the towering mountains and rivers as clear as the sky. So we've talked about how authors are very careful with the words that they choose to use in their text. So I want you to take a look carefully and see how the author, Alan Say, is describing grandfather. He met many people along the way. He shook hands with black men and white men, with yellow men and red men. The more he traveled, the more he longed to see new places and never thought of returning home. Of all the places he visited, he liked California best. He loved the strong sunlight there, the Sierra Mountains, the lonely seacoast. After a time, he returned to his village in Japan to marry his childhood sweetheart. Then he brought his bride to the new country. They made their home by the San Francisco Bay and had a baby girl. As his daughter grew, my grandfather began to think about his own childhood. He thought about his old friends. He remembered the mountains and rivers of his home. He surrounded himself with songbirds, but he could not forget. Finally, when his daughter was nearly grown, he could wait no more. He took his family and returned to his homeland. So now I want us to remember that the setting is about to change. Grandfather is returning to his homeland. Once again, he saw the mountains and rivers of his childhood. They were just as he had remembered them. Once again, he exchanged stories and laughed with his old friends. As you're really taking in this page, I want you to think, have you ever felt that way when you reunited with a friend, a close friend, or a family member, and you exchanged stories? How did that feel? But the village was not a place for a daughter from San Francisco, so my grandfather bought a house in a large city nearby. There the young woman fell in love, married, and sometime later, I was born. So here's the page on page 23 that tells us exactly who the narrator is and his relationship to the grandfather. But, oops, I was going to read that page again. When I was a small boy, my favorite weekend was a visit to my grandfather's house. He told me many stories about California. He raised warblers and silver eyes, but he could not forget the mountains and rivers of California, so he planned a trip. On this page, if you don't know what warblers and silver eyes, you can take a look at the illustration to see what these words could possibly mean. What is our figure looking at in this illustration? But a war began. Bombs fell from the sky and scattered our lives like leaves in a storm. When the war ended, there was nothing left of the city and of the house where my grandparents had lived. So they returned to the village where they had been children. But my grandfather never kept another songbird. The last time I saw him, my grandfather said that he longed to see California one more time. He never did. Oops. And when I was nearly grown, I left home and went to see California for myself. After a time, I came to love the land my grandfather had loved, and I stayed on until I had a daughter of my own. But I also missed the mountains and rivers of my childhood. I miss my old friends, so I return now and then, when I cannot still the longing in my heart. The funny thing is, the moment I am in one country, I am homesick for the other. I'm going to read this page again. This page is very important, and I want us to reread it and really soak this page in, okay? After a time, I came to love the land my grandfather had loved, and I stayed on and on until I had a daughter of my own. But I also miss the mountains and rivers of my childhood. I miss my old friends, so I return now and then when I cannot still the longing in my heart. The funny thing is, the moment I am in one country, I am homesick for the other. I think I know my grandfather now. I miss him very much. This is page 32. I also want to read the author's note right here, or about the author page. Alan Say, our author, was born in Yokohama, Japan, and came to the United States when he was 16. He illustrated his first children's book, published in 1972, in a photo studio between shooting assignments. Since then, he has written and illustrated many books, including Tree of Cranes, Allison, and Home of the Brave. He lives in Portland, Oregon. Okay, Oregon is another state in the United States of America. All right, that concludes today's third read aloud. So the last part of your classwork today before you get to your exit ticket is filling out 3 more sections of the story elements handout from yesterday. This will be underneath your evidence organizers, so you don't need to go back to your previous classwork.